You could fall in love with a television show on a Friday night and find it gone by spring, with no finale, no warning, sometimes not even a rerun. For a few short years, the American networks were obsessed with science fiction. The X-Files had proved a primetime crowd would happily spend an hour a week on wormholes, conspiracies, and things that shouldn't exist, and everyone wanted their own. Most of them had no idea what they had greenlit, and one by one they buried their boldest shows. Wrong time slots, slashed budgets, constant preemptions for sports, the plug pulled before the story could even start. One of the first to go asked a network audience to watch a squad of young Marines fight a war among the stars that they were never going to win. 5 seasons. That was the arc Glenn Morgan and James Wong had mapped out when they brought their first creation to Fox, fresh from the writer's room on The X-Files. Space, above and beyond, looked like Starship Troopers a year before Starship Troopers existed. A grim boots-in-the-mud war story set in the year 2063, following a squadron of green young Marines called the Wildcards as they fought a hostile alien race, the Chigs, from the deck of the carrier Saratoga. It treated its soldiers and their losses with a seriousness the genre rarely allowed on television. The Wildcards were frightened young people, one of them gestated in a tank rather than born, thrown into a war nobody back home fully understood. Morgan and Wong built them a real ensemble, led by Morgan Weiser, Kristen Cloak, and Rodney Rowland, and asked viewers to care whether each of them came home. For one season, it was about as close as broadcast television ever came to a serious war drama set in space. The trouble started with the schedule. Fox dropped the series into 7 o'clock on Sundays, directly opposite the immovable ratings fortress of 60 Minutes, then preempted it again and again whenever sports ran long. Variety had pegged the cost at somewhere between $1.5 and $2 million an episode. Steep money for the era and especially for a serialized drama. A conspicuous line item for an incoming Fox programming chief, Peter Roth, who by most accounts had little affection for the show he had inherited. The ratings, fighting that time slot, never recovered. One season was all the Wildcards got, 23 episodes, a war barely begun, and then silence. What those episodes built toward, though, has outlived almost everything that aired beside them. Morgan and Wong wrote toward a finale that refused every comfort the format usually offers, sending half the principal cast into a battle they did not come back from, and leaving the survivors staring down a war with no end in sight. It remains one of the bleakest, most unsentimental endings the genre has put on network television, the kind of ending a major network would almost never approve today. Reruns on the Sci-Fi channel kept the show in circulation through the early 2000s, and a long-delayed DVD set in November 2005 finally handed it the cult standing Fox never did. 3 decades on, fans are still campaigning for a revival, still hoping someone, somewhere, finishes the fight. Morgan and Wong had titled that last hour, "Tell Our Moms We Done Our Best." The premise alone should have told NBC what it was dealing with. Aliens had been steering human history from the shadows since the 1950s. The Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam buildup, even the British invasion were recast as moves in a slow alien war, and the creatures behind it could burrow inside a human host and take it over from within. The network put the whole thing on Saturday nights at 8 o'clock, in the slot where families were assumed to be watching together. That mismatch tells you most of what you need to know about how Dark Skies was handled. Bryce Zabel and Brent V. Friedman had written one of the most ambitious conspiracy premises television has ever attempted, a secret history in which a parasitic alien collective called the Hive sat behind the defining traumas of the 1960s. Eric Close and Megan Ward played John Longard and Kim Sayers, a young couple driven onto the run after they learned too much, hunted across the decade by the shadow agency Majestic 12, with the late J.T. Walsh lending genuine menace as the man who runs it. Tobe Hooper, already a giant of horror, directed the feature-length pilot, giving the whole enterprise a glossy cinematic weight the Saturday slot would never reward. And a still unknown Jerry Ryan turned up in what was her first series regular role, not long before Star Trek. Voyager made her a household name as 7 of 9. The plan was enormous, a 5-season Bible that would walk the conspiracy forward decade by decade, from the 60s all the way into the audience's own present. It is exactly the kind of slow burn that rewards a patient network, and patience was not on offer. 20 episodes in, citing soft ratings, NBC let it go. The show then spent the better part of a decade off the shelf entirely, snarled in a music licensing dispute that no one could resolve, until Shout Factory finally cleared the rights and released the complete run on DVD in January 2011. By then, it had already found its real home. The series became a fixture of late-night conspiracy radio, replayed and picked apart on programs like Coast to Coast AM, where its central idea never quite stopped sounding plausible, somewhere around 3 in the morning. On screen, the picture would drop to black and white, then bleed into hand-tinted color as Sidney Bloom reached through a telephone line and pulled a stranger into a shared waking dream. 4 years before The Matrix asked a mass audience whether their reality was real, Fox was already there on Friday nights, quietly airing one of the strangest things the network ever put its name to. Laurie Singer played Bloom, a phone company line worker who stumbles onto the fact that she can draw other people into a fifth, deeper level of virtual reality through the wires in their walls. The discovery does not stay hers for long. A shadow outfit called the Committee recruits her, then uses her, and the series spends its short life watching her work out just how badly she is being played. It was moody, slow, and genuinely experimental, the kind of show that belonged on late-night cable rather than a Friday network lineup. Janine Renshaw created it, and the cast ran far deeper than its low profile suggested. Anthony Stewart Head, a few months before Buffy turned him into a star, alongside Will Patton, David McCallum, and the Oscar-winning Louise Fletcher. The look did not come free either. Those dreamlike, color-tinted sequences pushed each episode toward $1.5 million, an art house budget on an ordinary network schedule. Fox produced 13 episodes and aired 10 of them before its patience ran out. The show occupied prime real estate, the slot directly before The X-Files, and still could not hold it. The final 3 installments sat unseen in the United States until a Sci-Fi Channel rerun finally caught up with them in 1997. There has still never been a proper home video or streaming release in North America in all the years since, which is a good part of why the series keeps such an odd, half-buried reputation among the few who caught it the first time around. That Friday night birth, though, was about to chew up another Fox experiment entirely. He walked away from a plane crash as a small boy, the only one who did, and ever since, trouble had a way of finding him first. Chance Harper, played with rumpled charm by D.B. Sweeney, was a freelance photographer who could not step into a room, a street, or a gas station without a disaster, a crime, or some small miracle unfolding 3 feet away. One week, he might walk straight into a robbery. The next, he might be the only person standing on the right corner to catch a falling child. Carl Schaefer, who had already conjured suburban unease on Erie, Indiana, built the series around that single uncanny idea, and around the one mystery Chance could never solve, the brother he had lost as a boy and never stopped trying to find. Fox handed it the same Friday night job it kept handing its science fiction: warm up the room before The X-Files. Schaefer leaned into the connection, even securing Chris Carter's blessing for an on-screen nod to Agent Mulder of the FBI, dangling a crossover the network never let happen. What the network did instead was preempt the show for sports and holidays, week after week, until whatever momentum it had built bled out of the schedule. 17 episodes later, in February 1996, Fox let it go. It was an easy show to love, which is what makes the ending sting. Sweeney's everyman was decent and a little sad. The tone hovered between melancholy and wonder, and the format could have run for years on charm alone. There has never been an official home video release. The show survives on traded tapes and the memory of a brief 1997 cable rerun. It is remembered now as one of the biggest what-if casualties of Fox's golden run, the kind of gentle, kind-hearted oddity that just needed a network with the patience to leave it alone. Whether it could have found its audience with a stable time slot is a question Fox made sure no one would ever get to answer. For a single television season, UPN bet its entire drama hopes on one show. Coleman Luck built it as a collision of Outbreak and The X-Files, a covert government unit, codenamed Delta X, racing to contain biological and chemical outbreaks before they could spread, with strange religious and supernatural currents running underneath the procedure. The science could tip into the metaphysical at any moment, which gave the early episodes a genuinely odd, unsettled charge. Luck had cut his teeth on the 1980s Twilight Zone revival, and you could feel that anthology instinct in the way each threat carried a moral as much as a menace. At its center were 2 virologists, Edward Marcase and Kimberly Sharoma, played by a very young Jeffrey Dean Morgan and Tamlin Tomita, and for 11 episodes the show had the makings of a sleeper. Then the panic set in. Facing soft ratings in January 1997, UPN did something drastic. It fired both of its leads at once, wrote them out, and rebuilt the series around a doctor who had spent the first half of the season as one of its antagonists, Daniel Cassian, played by Michael Harris, with a leather-jacketed newcomer, Dr. Brian Taft, brought in to fill the gap. The television historian John Kenneth Muir later called the overhaul a behind-the-scenes massacre, and audiences reacted about how you would expect. The retooled version limped to 19 episodes before UPN pulled it and handed the time slot to sitcoms, among them Clueless. No DVD or stream ever followed. The show lives on mostly as a case study in how fast a nervous network can dismantle its own program, gutting the cast and the chemistry that made it worth watching, which is a strange fate for a series whose biggest legacy turned out to be a casting footnote. The unknown playing virologist Edward Marcase for those first 11 episodes was Jeffrey Dean Morgan, years before The Walking Dead and Supernatural would make him a genre household name. In the fall of 1994, NBC handed Amblin Entertainment a Sunday night berth and a genuinely ambitious idea, the kind of long-form gamble the broadcast networks almost never took back then. The setup was pure frontier myth. A group of refugees flee a dying space station civilization aboard the Eden Project, searching for a new home and, more urgently, for a cure for the sickness that is killing their children, an illness they call the Syndrome. Their ship goes down on an alien world named G889, and the survivors have to learn the planet before it unmakes them. It was about the most cinematic premise Amblin had ever handed a television network. The cast was deep and a little eclectic. Deborah Ferrantino as the expedition's leader, Devin Adair alongside Clancy Brown, Antonio Sabato Jr., Rebecca Gayhart, and Jessica Steen. The production decamped to the high desert around Santa Fe and shot the whole thing on location, which looked extraordinary and cost a fortune. Reportedly, the budget ran toward $2 million an episode, an almost reckless level of investment for a 1994 network drama. None of it found a forgiving home on the schedule. NBC parked the series at 7 o'clock on Sundays, in the same graveyard slot where so many of these shows ran aground against 60 Minutes, and asked a 1994 audience to commit to a story that only paid off if you watched every single week, in an era before that was how people watched television. 21 episodes aired between November 1994 and June 1995, and that was the end of it. The behind-the-scenes air was no warmer. Steven Spielberg is said to have removed his executive producer credit after seeing the pilot, and staff at the network and the studio were reportedly calling the show Gilligan's Planet among themselves. What is striking, looking back, is how much of it arrived early. The series gave science fiction television a female mission commander 2 full months before Star Trek. Voyager introduced Captain Janeway, and its blueprint, a band of stranded survivors decoding a hostile, mysterious land, runs straight through Lost and through Spielberg's own Terra Nova years later. The show simply got there before audiences were ready to follow, and it never got to finish the thought. The final episode left Devin Adair seemingly dying, then being remade by the planet's enigmatic native race, the Terrians, into something the story never explained, and the credits rolled on that image for the last time. 3 decades later, no one has any idea what was supposed to happen next. He stepped away from his own dinner table for barely 2 minutes. When he came back, his wife looked at him like a stranger. The restaurant staff swore they had never seen him before, and the entire life he had walked in with had simply been deleted. I have watched a lot of paranoid television, and I still think that is one of the great cold opens of the decade. The show was Lawrence Herzog's, and the man losing his mind in real time was photojournalist Thomas Vale, played by Bruce Greenwood at the absolute height of his hunted everyman powers. Vale's crime, as far as he can tell, is a single photograph he took in South America, an image of something he was never meant to witness, filed away under the title Hidden Agenda. Somebody wants that negative badly enough to erase a man to get it. His marriage, his money, his work, even an old friend who turns up dead. It owed an obvious debt to the prisoner and the fugitive, and it arrived to some of the warmest reviews of the season. Mark Snow, who you know whether you realize it or not from the X-Files, scored the whole thing in that same uneasy register. And for a while there, I genuinely believed UPN had the smartest show on television. The trouble, when it came from inside the show. Partway through the run, Herzog fell out with UPN and the studio over where the story should go, and they brought in a new voice to steer it, Joel Surnow, who would later co-create 24. Herzog got pushed to the edges of his own series, and the network canceled it in the spring of 1996 after 25 episodes. The finale tied off a thread or two and left the big questions, the swapped-out senators, the real meaning of that photograph, hanging in the dark forever. A 2006 box set and a full series upload to the Internet Archive have kept it findable for the faithful, and it holds up better than almost anything else from that season. But every time I revisit it, I'm left with the same itch the show never got to scratch. What exactly was on that negative, and who decided one man's whole existence was a fair price for it? Late one summer, the Sci-Fi channel slipped a quiet little anthology onto its schedule, every episode set in the same imagined future metropolis called Betaville. The name was a wink at Goddard's Alphaville, and the ambition behind it was real. Rather than spin its own stories, the series did something almost no television does. It adapted a different published work of science fiction every week by a genuinely first-rate author, and gave each one a glossy, self-contained half-hour. The roster of source material is the part that still impresses. Over 13 episodes, the series drew on James Tiptree Jr., who's The Girl Who Was Plugged In foresaw influencer culture by decades, along with John Varley, Greg Egan, Donald E. Westlake, Alan Dean Foster, and Ron Golar. Mining cloning, simulated reality, engineered people, and faith turned into a racket years before a show called Black Mirror made that kind of thing a brand. The casts were better than the show's profile too, rotating through Mayim Bialik, Henry Rollins, Ice-T, Alice Kriege, Lachlan Monroe, and Dana Ashbrook. It was shot in Canada with real production design money, a good deal of it on the campus of Simon Fraser University, and it looked like nothing else the channel was airing. It ran from August into November of 1998, and then it was simply gone, having never drawn the audience the channel needed to justify a second season. Sci-Fi never even rolled it into syndication, and to this day, there is no proper home video or streaming release anywhere in North America. So an anthology that adapted some of the finest short fiction the genre ever produced, and that was poking at engineered humanity and simulated worlds a full decade ahead of the streaming era, has effectively vanished. It is exactly the kind of library a streaming service would love to have now, a full season of prestige short fiction with a different great author behind every episode. That silence is the real loss. An Air Force pilot flew into the Bermuda Triangle and vanished. Half a century later, he walked back into the world without having aged a single day, carrying gifts he could not fully explain. The power to heal the sick, to soothe the desperate, to make ordinary objects glow, to know things he had no honest way of knowing, and a strange conviction that he had been sent back to steer humanity away from disaster. That was the premise of Fox's first venture into series television from Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin, the team behind Independence Day. And it put John Corbett, fresh off Northern exposure, in the role of the returned pilot, Adam MacArthur. The structure borrowed openly from The Fugitive. Adam crossed the country on foot, doing good and changing lives, while an obsessive NSA colonel and a dogged FBI agent stayed half a step behind him, never sure whether they were hunting a threat or a miracle. What made the show genuinely ahead of its moment, though, was happening off the screen. It launched alongside a tied-in companion series that played out on the web, an early stab at what would later be called two-screen storytelling, at a time when most viewers were still listening to their modems connect. The effects work was strong enough to earn a 1998 Primetime Emmy nomination for special visual effects, one of 6 award nominations the series collected. None of that bought it more time. All 13 episodes aired across the winter of 1997 and 1998, and even with respectable early numbers, Fox lost its appetite for costly science fiction, just as Emmerich and Devlin turned their attention to a very expensive Godzilla movie of their own. The show has never been properly reissued, though it still carries a small, loyal following and a steady 7 out of 10 from thousands of votes online. It would not be the last gorgeous, effects-driven cancellation on this list to earn an Emmy nod on its way out the door. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. Philip K. Dick wrote that, and a small Canadian and German co-production took the idea more to heart than its title ever suggested. Underneath a name borrowed from the Schwarzenegger blockbuster sat a moody, rain-slick detective story, soaked in Blade Runner and in Dick's own Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is exactly where its creator Art Monterastelli always said his head had been. Michael Easton played Detective David Hume. Carl Pruner played his android partner, Ian Favre. The two of them worked the Citizens Protection Bureau in a smog-choked city run, in practice, by a cartel of megacorporations with names like Recale and Uber Braun. The cases they cracked were closer to philosophy than to action, all questions of memory, identity, and what a machine owes the people who built it. The look was the draw, genuinely beautiful, expensive cyberpunk that earned a 1999 Primetime Emmy nomination for special visual effects. It reached Canadian screens first in January 1999 and crossed to American viewers on Showtime that March. 22 episodes were made, and that was the whole of it. The series went out mid-stride, on a cliffhanger that left the android Favre all but destroyed and shut down Hume's marriage in pieces, and the long-vanished man who built Favre suddenly revealed to be alive. A Canadian DVD eventually preserved all 22 episodes uncut, but the United States never got a proper release of its own. So a cyberpunk noir this good sits where so much of this genre ends up, admired by the few who found it, and frozen on a question it was never allowed to answer. 1.6%. That is the entire genetic gap the show built its dread on. The thin sliver of DNA separating ordinary people from a new kind of human, faster, stronger, sharper, and missing whatever it is in us that feels for anyone else. I will be honest, the premise still gets under my skin a little. What unsettles me is the framing of it. Not a threat on the horizon, but a species already here, already among us, already deciding we are the lesser model. It takes the most reassuring story we tell ourselves, that we are the finished version of humanity, and turns that comfort over to see what is underneath. The series gave Deborah Messing her first leading role on television, months before Will and Grace turned her into a star, and she is terrific in it as bioanthropologist Dr. Sloane Parker, the one who first works out what is happening. The new species has a name, Homo dominant, and a chilling lack of warmth, and it has begun to regard the rest of us the way we regard livestock, as a resource and an inconvenience rather than as equals. Adam Stork plays one of them who seems maybe to be on Sloane's side, a romance the show kept you usefully unsure about, and the supporting bench is stacked with people you would know on sight. Larry Drake, Frankie Faison, and Vincent Ventresca among them. It was chewing on Darwin, empathy, and the question of human survival, years ahead of Heroes or the 4400. And when it was firing, it was real, paranoid, grown-up science fiction with a genuinely upsetting idea at its core, which makes how it got treated genuinely annoying. ABC, by most accounts, only ordered the thing in the first place to satisfy a leftover Warner Brothers contract from its Lois and Clark days, treated it like an obligation rather than an asset, and then scheduled it so erratically that it posted what was at the time the lowest Thursday night rating in the network's history. The final 5 episodes were burned off across a couple of summer weeks in 1998, dumped into the schedule with almost no promotion, and that was that, on a gut punch of a cliffhanger that left a key character locked away by his own kind with no rescue in sight. Then came the cruelest, almost funny twist of all. Fans campaigned for a real ending for 5 solid years. The closest anyone ever got was a blink and you miss it cameo from Adam Stork, tucked into a 2000 episode of The Invisible Man, like a private apology to the people still waiting. Whether Sloane Parker ever stood a chance against what was coming is something the show and the network left us to argue about forever. The network kept apologizing. For weeks, by their own account, Chris Carter and his showrunner Frank Spotnitz were getting notes from Fox conceding it had botched the launch, and then Fox canceled the show anyway, after 3 episodes. That is a strange way to treat what was supposed to be the heir to the X-Files. Carter had adapted a comic by James Hudnall and Andrew Paquette into a story about a soldier, played by Scott Bairstow, who is dropped into a hyper-realistic military simulation and discovers it has been seized by a self-styled tyrant, played with obvious relish by Terry O'Quinn, who now rules a digital post-war America from inside the machine. The comic had handed Carter a ready-made hook, a war game so convincing the soldiers trapped inside, it cannot always tell it from the real thing. And he cast the same D.B. Sweeney we met a few entries back, the one forever stumbling into catastrophe on Strange Luck, here as a battle-hardened ally, with Samantha Mathis rounding out the trio. It premiered in October 1999, only months after The Matrix had primed mainstream audiences for exactly this kind of question about simulated worlds, and on paper it should have been the easy heir to Fox's biggest hit. Fox barely promoted it. Programming chief Doug Herzog pulled it after those 3 episodes, and the move blindsided the people who made it. The remaining 6 of the 9 produced episodes eventually surfaced on FX in 2000, and the full run reached DVD in 2004. Along the way, the comics creators won a precedent-setting trademark lawsuit that forced Fox to fix the on-screen credit, a small vindication for the people whose work had started it all. The real reason to remember it, though, is how unnervingly right it turned out to be. A show about an authoritarian power ruling through a faked, totally immersive reality, about surveillance and manufactured truth, looks less like science fiction every year, and Carter has never entirely forgiven the network that gave up on it before it ever found its feet. It won its category at the Saturn Awards. It pulled better than 6 million viewers a week, and the network shut it down anyway, having simply decided the show cost too much to keep alive. I have never quite gotten over this one, so let me try to do it justice. The mind behind it was Glenn Gordon Caron, who had already made Moonlighting, and the premise is so strange it has no business being as moving as it is. A rumpled, overweight insurance executive named Michael Wiseman, played by John Goodman, dies in a subway accident. A secret branch of the government preserves his brain and installs it inside a genetically engineered, physically perfect new body, now played by Eric Close, all under the supervision of a charming and slippery handler, Dr. Theodore Morris, played by Dennis Haysbert. There is one rule, and it is the rule the whole series aches around. Michael can never ever make contact with his wife, Lisa, or his daughter, Heather, played by Heather Matarazzo. If he does, Morris makes clear the people he loves are the ones who will pay for it. So Michael gets a second life and a perfect body, and the one thing he wants, the only thing, is the family he is forbidden to touch. So it became this impossible thing, a superhero show, a spy show, and a love story about a husband watching his own family from across the street, unable to say a word. The work was recognized too. It swept its categories at the 2000 Saturn Awards, taking the prize for Best Network Series, with wins for Margaret Collin and, in the category's very first year, Dennis Haysbert, and it drew a healthy audience every week. The problem was the math. Each episode reportedly ran around $2.4 million. CBS was at war with Paramount over dragging production from New York out to Los Angeles, and the network canceled it after 22 episodes, calling it an expense it could not justify. And then Caron did the thing that still breaks my heart and impresses me in equal measure. He had become convinced the head of CBS simply never understood the show. So rather than wrapping things up gently and hoping for a reprieve, he ended the finale, an episode he pointedly called The Eggman Cometh. on the most deliberately savage cliffhanger he could build. In the final minutes, Close's character finally tells his family the truth and rushes them out of the house seconds before a team led by Dr. Morris crashes through the door behind them. At the very same moment, the most dangerous villain from the show's first run walks straight out the front gate of a maximum security prison, free with hired muscle at his side, played by the wrestler Mick Foley. That is the image the series ends on, two catastrophes breaking at once. Karen froze the story right there in May of 2000 as a dare to anyone who might ever want to continue it. No one ever did. It has not moved an inch since. 13 shows, and very nearly the same story every time. A network gets nervous, a time slot gets botched, a budget gets cut, somebody upstairs decides the audience isn't there, and a strange, brilliant, ahead-of-its-time idea gets buried before it can grow into whatever it was meant to be. What gets me, though, is that not one of them actually died. Traded tapes, late-night reruns, box sets that took a decade to arrive, archive uploads, and fan campaigns that in one case ran for 5 years past cancellation kept these shows breathing long after the people who made them had moved on. The networks gave up, the audience didn't. So I want to hear from you, because half the fun of these is the arguing. Which of these did you actually tape off the TV back in the day, and which one would you most want to see finished? And which favorite did I leave out, your Strange World, your Brimstone, your 7 Days? Drop it in the comments. Give the video a like if any of these brought a memory back. And if you want more trips into the television the networks forgot, that subscribe button is how you find the next one. Until then, I'll see you on the same wavelength, same lost frequency.